Hello, BookTube. I have mail for you today, but it's only one piece of mail. It's one book package. We haven't done one book package in a while. To see, I think it's from a publisher, and we'll see what we make of it. What we make of that one book, the whole process of it. It's a beautiful, beautiful day here. Mid 50s Fahrenheit. Not a cloud in the sky. Pure blue from one end to the other. No wind. No remaining snow, no hardness to the ground. The ground is soft and spongy. The trees are budding out. Just lovely. So there could be more mail on the way. But we've got one package here. Let's look at one package and see what it is. And of course, if this is, I don't know what this is, of course, because I'm opening it now. But if it's a double or something like that, then I don't have to upload this video. Okay. All right. This comes with an invoice, but this is something that we've seen before. This will do for a one book mail haul. This is the finished copy of Marie Favreau's The Horde: How the Mongols Changed the World, a new book from the Belknap Press of Harvard University Press. I just have the invoice, so and I'm trying to remember, but I think this comes out in April. I think this is an April release. And this is a story. Well, some of you may not have seen the video. First, let's hear about the book. This is the finished copy, and then we'll talk about what the process is of one book. The Mongols are widely known for one thing: conquest. In the first comprehensive history of the Horde, the western portion of the Mongol Empire that arose after the death of Genghis Khan, Marie Favreau shows that the accomplishments of the Mongols extended far beyond war. For 300 years, the Horde was no less a force in global development than Rome had been. It left behind a profound legacy in Europe, Russia, Central Asia, and the Middle East, palpable to this day. The author takes us inside one of the most powerful sources of cross-border integration in world history. The Horde was the central node in the Eurasian commercial boom of the 13th and 14th centuries and was a conduit for exchanges across thousands of miles. Its unique political regime, a complex power-sharing arrangement among the Khan and the nobility, rewarded skillful administrators and diplomats and fostered an economic order that was mobile, organized, and innovative. From its capital at Sarai on the lower Volga River, the Horde provided a governance model for Russia, influenced social practice and state structure across Islamic cultures, disseminated sophisticated theories about the natural world, and introduced novel ideas of religious tolerance. And this comes out in April. This is the finished copy. So if we're talking about getting one book in the mail, well, first, if you're a book reviewer, for instance, if we talk about it in that lens, the first thing you get is a heads up that the book is coming. Then maybe you get a watermarked PDF. Most publicists understand that most working book critics don't really like working off PDFs. They like a book in hand, but it's not necessary. And sometimes that's all you get. But if you're going to get more, if you're going to get a physical dimension, a printed dimension, then the first thing you'll get is an ARC, an advanced reader's copy, like the one we saw for this book. And that's, there are etiquette posts all over such things saying, this is not the finished copy of the book. Obviously, so if you come across niggling little errors, things that look like they are mere lapses in process, better to take a global step back on things like that than to go in knives bared on such things under the assumption that such things will be fixed in the finished copy. So, you don't want to criticize the book for things that the public is never going to see, and you also don't want to make yourself look foolish by harping on praising or criticizing something that isn't present in the book. This is in the finished book. This is especially important for new reviewers who maybe don't have a firm editor, or maybe the editor is harried and busy elsewhere, and a new reviewer might say, well, gee, might get the advanced reader's copy and think, well, I should, out of my 800 words, I should surely spare an acidic paragraph for how a book like this really does need maps and illustrations, because you're too new to know that those things will appear in the finished copy. And if the editor doesn't catch it, a paragraph like that's going to make you look foolish. It's going to make the journal look foolish. But then you get the finished copy. And this is what's going to be in bookstores. So any errors that are here, any problems that are in this book, procedural or otherwise, are fair game for the critic. But in between the length of time between the advanced copy and that initial heads up and the finished copy, all sorts of decisions will be made by, let's say, a book section editor. A book section editor will get all of those emails. They'll get all of those heads up. It won't just be freelance book. There are a handful of freelance book reviewers who get all these things anyway from publishers, just because they're always out flogging their work. So it's good for them to have a copy of the book. For you, if you're a publisher, it's just good from your point of view for them to have a copy of the book. But book section editors get all of this stuff because they are planning their coverage, and usually they're doing it a couple of months out. So they know how much space they have, they know what writers they have, they know what they want to cover. It's their vision, their page reflects their vision. And the length of time between those initial heads up and that initial book, which, you can't hold every jot and tittle in that initial book to the fire. But the main arguments, the main pros, even if there are typos, you can certainly get to work chewing and digesting that, because that's not going to change between the advanced copy and the finished copy. If you're a book section editor, let's say, you're getting that stuff and you're mulling it over. And in a case of a book like this, okay, this is nonfiction, so there are going to be substantial differences between the advanced copy and the finished copy, and they're going to be important. Any nonfiction book reviewer will tell you they would infinitely prefer to review the book from a finished copy. Not only do they have all the bells and whistles in place at last, but they also have a working index and a working bibliography, and sometimes those things aren't in the advanced copy. It's a different person that's been contracted to do them, different deadlines, different workloads. A lot of times they aren't in the advanced copy. But in a book like this, if you're a book section editor, let's say you're the book section editor for book sections, independent book sections in newspapers across the country are drying out mighty fast. There aren't nearly as many as there were even 50 years ago. But let's say 50 years ago, every small newspaper in the country had its own individual, unique content with its own stable of writers. And it wasn't, most of them didn't dream of pulling copy off the wire unless they had an egregious hole to fill, especially something like the arts section, dance, music, local theater coverage, books coverage. Something like that, you got your own copy, and there were, you could have a one stoplight Jerkwaterburg town, you'd still have 3 papers. That isn't true anymore. But let's say instead of picking on anybody now, I don't actually know now. I hear horror stories all the time of papers, from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution to the Seattle Times to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I hear horror stories all the time from people, either from writers or from editors, saying, yeah, we don't do it anymore. There isn't the money. There isn't the space and there isn't the money, so we just don't do it anymore. Some newspapers in 2021 who had very active, lively books coverage 50 years ago don't do it at all. They don't review books at all anymore. Even if the newspapers are still in business, they still don't do it. But so let's say the Des Moines Register from 50 years ago. The Des Moines Register 50 years ago, and what was, I think probably we'll look back and say, was the heyday of print journalism. That book section editor, the book section editor for the Des Moines Register 50 years ago, is going to look at this book. It's the book section's editor's job to be the sort of eye in the sky overlooking the whole of the coverage. You want it to be balanced. You want it to interest all of your readers, not just some of them. You especially don't want it to reflect merely your own interests. And you want to go where you want to balance between the things that are obviously important, the things that are major, so that everybody, all of your readers, the Des Moines Register 50 years ago would probably have reached 100,000 readers. You want to balance your coverage so that your coverage is going to include books that are high-profile releases that your readers will see in bookstores. That you definitely want them to feel, when they think about your books coverage, that it is, in addition to anything else, in addition to being provocative, thought-provoking, challenging, outraging, the number one thing they have to feel is that it's useful. Oh, you failed. So, the Des Moines Register's book section editors let's say they're looking at April, and they're trying to balance their books coverage for April. They're a daily with a weekend edition, with a big weekend edition with more space. So they have a lot of room for books. And if, let's say, they cap their reviews at 600 words, There's a lot of stuff for them to cover, but you know as well as I do, if you're a book person, if you go to bookstores, you know as well as I do that no matter how much room you have, it's a drop in the bucket compared to how much is out there, to how much is coming. Just this endless torrent of books that are coming. You can't cover them all. You can't even mention them all. Some book journals in the course of the last 200 years have tried. So they would commission full-length reviews, but then they would have a column where they would just list all the books that they received that came into the office, so they could at least acknowledge it in some way, but even that doesn't do it. There's just no way. So you have to make decisions, right? And in the course of, if you do that eye in the sky, look at all of the books that are coming out in April, for instance. There are going to be some major releases in April that you can't ignore. If you're a responsible book section editor and you have the space and you are commissioning original copy, there are going to be titles in April that you can't ignore. Simple as that. But you're going to have leeway after that. And a book like this presents you with challenges, maybe enough challenges to make it worth reviewing. Because this author is making all sorts of controversial claims. The Mongol hordes are known for conquest, yes, but that's a euphemism. They're known for wholesale slaughter. They're known for genocide. They would invest a town and then murder everyone. And it was commented on by people at the time in the 13th and 14th century. The blood-soaked barons in Europe would say, even by our standards, this is incredibly barbaric. You're murdering the women. You're murdering the children. You're murdering the infirm. You're murdering people who came to you under a flag of truce saying the ruling cabal of the city did this, we did not. You're murdering everyone, literally rivers of blood in the gutters. It's hard to graft onto that the idea of any kind of cultural dissemination. And that book section editor at the Des Moines Register 50 years ago, let's say this showed up then. There was a book on the Mongols 50 years ago, but it was a novel, and it hewed the party line. The party line of this book is obviously designed to fight against, which is that they were just a gigantic wave of mounted ravenous barbarians. This author is saying different. This author is saying that they did a lot more than that. And if you're that book section editor, you're going to pause at one part of the cover copy. Let's see if we can find it. The Horde provided a governance model for Russia. Okay, you're going to pause right there, because governance and Russia really strike a discordant note, right? For almost all of Russia's history, for all of the glories of its art, its novels, its poetry, its history, for all of the undoubted immensity of its armed forces, it's in all that time almost always been ineptly governed. Really ineptly governed, and governed in a way that lends itself not only to ineptitude but to gross corruption. It's governed by satraps who own their power at the will of some kind of prince who operates outside the law, who can kill at will. That has almost always been true in Russian governance, and it has led to a continual cycle of boom and bust. Yet there have been revolutions, but in the long intervals between those revolutions, you have had Gauleiter figures, just Tartar overlords figures who can get immensely wealthy. Today we call them oligarchs. When we talk about Russia's failed governments, we call them oligarchs. And they get to do that because they're on the right side of the Khan. And the reason they know they're on the right side of the Khan is because they're still alive. If they were on the wrong side of the Khan, he would kill them. He would have them killed. I don't think that it takes much of a stretch of the liberal Western imagination to say that's bad governance. And that has been the pattern in Russia through 1,000 years at least, so, since the Horde, since the Mongol hordes. Okay, that book section editor is seeing that part, saying they've been provided a governance model for Russia. Okay, that's bad. That's a bad thing. That's not anything to credit. That's a bad thing. But what's the next thing? Influenced social practice and state structure across Islamic cultures. Okay. In many, many cases throughout the last 1,000 years, since the 7th and 8th century, in many, many cases, that also has been bad. That also has been a sign for the enslavement of women, the summary execution of non-believers, atheists, homosexuals, a repressive theocracy governing its people through fear and intimidation and people ratting each other out. Those characteristics have been, you might say, okay, well, those were by and large characteristics of the whole of the world 1,000 years ago. But nevertheless, this author is claiming that some of those models, the cover copy anyway, is strongly implying that some of those models are positive, and they're not. If they came from the Mongol horde, then if anything, we need to reassess them downward instead of upward. But let's go on here. Disseminated sophisticated theories about the natural world. If you're that book section editor at the Des Moines Register, you are going to think that sounds awful fishy. First of all, disseminated is different from originated, right? So we're not saying that the horde had any kind of enlightened scientific ideas of their own. Merely that a slave that they didn't kill in one part of Eurasia was eventually forced marched to another part of Eurasia, somehow didn't die of exposure or starvation, and managed to disseminate those ideas when they were enslaved in a different part of Eurasia. That might be true. That I don't think you can make a claim for dissemination of knowledge or culture or the natural sciences for the horde that goes anywhere beyond that. Those individual warlords with their pavilions set up on the plain and their beheaded enemies in a ring around the front door weren't very interested in proto-Copernican science, I don't think. We'll have to see what the author says. But you will, if you were that book section editor, you'd be well within your rights to read that and think, this sounds like special pleading. It sounds like a bill of goods. And what is the last one? Introduce novel ideas of religious tolerance. And if you're that book section editor, you're going to say, okay, well, as a book section editor, it's my job to know a little about a lot. And my knowledge of that particular aspect of the legacy of the horde shows itself most clearly in the Islamic countries that this author is saying the horde influenced, whose idea of religious tolerance was to fine, publicly humiliate, and sometimes publicly mutilate barbarians, unbelievers. They could stay. They could conduct a kind of commerce in your city. But it was not only perfectly permissible, but encouraged for children to laugh at them in the street, pelt them with something, accuse them falsely of something, and fine the daylights out of them. Not for any offense, but because they don't believe, because they won't profess. So if the horde disseminated those ideas are bad. And that doesn't reflect well on the horde. So, but one way or another, whether or not any of those things are true, and whether or not this author convincingly rebuts them, that does make this an interesting book. Right? Quite apart from anything else. That does make this considerably more interesting to a general reader of history than, for instance, the 80 millionth regurgitation of the Battle of Antietam. Or the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. If you get a big book on that subject that challenges no orthodoxies, tries to do no original thinking, break no new original ground, if you have that and you have this, and you've got only a limited amount of space, you might pick this one. So the one book that comes in, of course, if you were a book section editor at the Des Moines Register 50 years ago, or even today, you wouldn't get just one book in the mail in one day. But those are some of the things that you'd have to think about if you got that one book in the mail. Do I cover this? Is the general big question. Do I cover this? Is this one of the books that makes the cut and gets covered? And if it is, why? Are those the reasons why? Is it thought-provoking in an interesting way? Is it, I mean, if an author could easily write a book like this, paradigm-shattering almost anything. If the author's an idiot and doesn't know their sources at all, then it's not going to matter. You're still not going to cover it, right? If you're that editor, you might get, at the time, you might have got all sorts of things about how aliens built the pyramids. That also is paradigm challenging. That also is consensus defying, but it's nonsense, so you wouldn't cover it. Whereas something like this, you might. So there you go. That's one book in the mail. It's the finished copy of The Horde. And now the question is, I mean, with, for instance, those of you who are new to this channel, in addition to being a reviewer, I'm also one of the editors at Open Letters Review. an online literary journal where we review new releases, and where any editor on the masthead has virtually free reign over what they write about. We have a relatively normal length for pieces. Usually 800 to 1,000 words is about what we do, or less than that if you can still do a good job. But new releases only, and as an editor there, I could review this book anyway, so I don't have to worry about it. But online publications don't have the same kind of hassle anyway, because you're not fighting for space. You're not juggling advertisements and other space-hungry departments in the same newspaper. So it becomes much more of a very caustic thing to figure out who's going to make it and who's not into that final coverage. So you would look at this book and you would think it is interesting. And a reviewer who knows their salt, that might be tough to find, but if you can find a reviewer who knows the subject, they'll have a good time arguing with this book and maybe celebrating it in the end. And your readers will find that interesting, because maybe almost certainly they have settled ideas about what the Mongol hordes were all about, and this book is telling you and them that isn't true, that stuff isn't true, or that there are a lot of nuances that aren't included in that kind of a model. So you might look at April's releases and say, well, I've got the whole list here, or as complete as the list is ever going to be, and there are only about 5 candidates for history. I want to have at least one history review in my coverage for April. There are only about 5 candidates, and this is by far the most interesting one, so I will go with this one. Now you've got the finished copy. The finished copy is what you will send out to the reviewer that hopefully you have already found. Hopefully, ideally, you have made this decision with the advanced copies. So that the reviewer is already working on the thing, because you can't count on stumbling across a Kingsley Amis who can get a book like this, marshal all the sources or resources that they need overnight, and write a really interesting 800-word review in 2 days. You can't count on that. You can't count on someone even being able to do that in a month. Most reviewers can't do that in a month, so you would need to get them the advanced copy and then get them the finished copy and be constantly checking in on them. It's all a big process. And it's fascinating. I think this would make the cut. I do, in a print newspaper. I think it would. We'll have occasion to talk about small print newspaper book sections in due time. In the meantime, that was our one book. I don't know if this was interesting. I'll look it over before, and if it's not, I won't upload it. But in the meantime, we have plenty of else to talk about. So I'll wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.